one of the more iconic steam locomotives of the Big Four era of Britain's railways, the Bulleid Pacifics of the Southern Railway were a widespread fleet of dedicated express passenger engines, which were the power behind top-line services south of London on both high-density commuter routes and seasonal summer resort trains, although sadly, their comparatively late entry into service meant they came in long after the Art Deco era for which engines like these were designed, and would instead spend nearly all of their careers working through the protracted demise of steam traction in the UK. The story of the Bulleid Pacifics begins in the early 1930s, when it became apparent to the management of the Southern Railway, one of the Big Four railway companies of Britain established under the 1923 Grouping Act, that in their drive to introduce a widespread and highly modern third rail electrification system across their vast network of main lines and commuter routes, they had neglected to thoroughly modify their extensive fleet of steam locomotives for long-distance expresses beyond the end of the electrics, specifically on mainline services east to Ashford, Dover and Folkestone to connect with Channel ferries to Europe, and west to Southampton, Bournemouth, Salisbury, Exeter, and to the resort destinations of Weymouth, Bude, Padstow and Ilfracombe. By the middle of the decade, the Southern Railway's long-distance steam locomotive fleet comprised a motley selection of types which dated back to the end of World War I, including the 74-strong fleet of LSWR N15s, which were first introduced in 1918 and were the power of mainline expresses to the south coast and Exeter, the 16 examples of the extremely powerful but troublesome Lord Nelson class of 1926, and the Schools class of 1930, of which 40 were built and proved to be highly successful machines which were lauded by engine crews for their performance. However, in terms of design, it was imperative for the Southern Railway to match the other Big Four companies for highly modernised steam locomotives, and following the retirement of the general manager of the Southern Railway, Sir Herbert Walker, and Richard Maunsell, the chief mechanical engineer of the company, in 1937, the latter's replacement, Oliver Vaughan Snell Bulleid, was tasked with preparing designs for 20 express passenger locomotives by the then newly appointed company manager, Gilbert Slumper. Bulleid, whose career began with the Great Northern Railway back in 1911, and later saw work with its grouping-era successor, the London and North Eastern Railway, faced a difficult task as he needed to present his brand-new locomotive design as soon as possible, and thus he started early concepts behind what would become the Merchant Navy Class Pacific, which had been developed in response to an eastern section requirement outlining the need to maintain an average speed of 60 miles an hour from start to stop on 600-ton boat trains between London Victoria and Dover Marine. This requirement not only being for the purposes of providing the fastest journey time for high-priority continental ferry passengers, but also to avoid the slower steam engines holding up vital electric commuter services on the way out of London. With the majority of the design work taking place at the Southern Railway's drawing office in Brighton, as well as at the Ashford and Eastleigh works, Bulleid designed the locomotive while enforcing the highest possible secrecy among his development staff, with the eventual product being a locomotive comprising a 462 wheel configuration driven by three 18-inch diameter cylinders, with original intentions to utilize a gear-driven valve gear being dropped due to space restrictions within the frames and wartime material shortages, forcing Bulleid to instead adopt a unique chain-driven valve gear that was sealed inside an oil bath in order to provide constant lubrication to the moving parts, another feature unique to this class of locomotive. Other features of the design included unusual 6'2" Bulleid Firth Brown driving wheels, which were both lighter and stronger than the spoked equivalent, steam-powered clasp brakes that gripped the wheels by way of a scissor action, where the two middle brake hangers held 2 brake blocks each, while the two outside hangers on the leading and rear driving wheels held 1 block each, an all-welded firebox which was cheaper to build and install than a regular riveted firebox, and most notably of all, the air-smooth sheet steel casing, which, contrary to popular belief, was not done for the purposes of streamlining, as the locomotive had a flat front, it instead being introduced as a means of lifting exhaust gases and to aid in the cleaning of the locomotive with mechanical carriage washers, so as to reduce labour costs. Bulleid was also conscious of the needs of engine drivers and firemen, and therefore designed the locomotive's cab to be as ergonomic as possible in order to promote safe operation of the engine, providing electric lighting on both the locomotive and the footplate that was powered by a steam-driven generator fitted below the footplate, while the gauges were lit by ultraviolet light, so as to enable clearer nighttime vision of the boiler steam pressure gauge and the brake pipe vacuum gauge, working to solve a problem of dazzle that made it easier for the crew to see signals along the track, the firemen also being aided by a steam-operated treadle that used steam pressure to open the firehole doors when shoveling coal, and the footplate was entirely enclosed so as to improve working conditions during the winter months. In the end, the first engine emerged from the Eastleigh Works on February 18, 1941, and was christened the name Channel Packet, this locomotive being named at a special ceremony on March 10th, with the then Minister of Transport, Lieutenant Colonel J.T.C. Moore Brabazon, famous for chairing the eponymous Brabazon Committee for the development of post-war commercial airliners, having the honour of unveiling the nameplate, the engine adopting the number 21C1 under Bulleid's unique numbering system, 2 being the number of leading bogie axles, 1 being the number of trailing bogie axles, C being the 3 coupled axles, and 1 being the engine number. While the Channel Packet was undeniably an express passenger locomotive, in order to avoid the economical restrictions of World War II stifling his abilities to produce the remainder of the fleet, he allocated his new type under the mixed traffic designation, allowing for a smooth production run with minimal intervention from the Ministry of Transport, although following the construction of a second prototype, 21C2 Union Castle, in June 1941, it was found that these 2 engines were 7 tons over the specified weight, and, at the insistence of the Southern Railway civil engineer, production of the remainder was halted until steps were taken to reduce the locomotive's bulk, which was achieved by using thinner steel plates for the frame stretchers, covering the boiler cladding, and enlarging the existing lightning holes in the main frames, the remaining 8 locomotives in the pilot batch being delivered between September 1941 and July 1942. With World War II continuing into its 4th year, meaning the continental boat trains these locomotives were built to haul remained suspended, the Merchant Navy class had many other important tasks to perform across the network of the Southern Railway, including top-line expresses to Dover, Southampton, Bournemouth and Exeter. But with an overall weight of 84 tons, the locomotives were only suited for use on the trunk routes east and west of London, and with Bulleid conscious that, with the lack of maintenance being undertaken on the permanent way due to wartime rationing, a new breed of lighter Pacific locomotive would be needed to serve the company's many secondary routes, such as the narrow resort branch lines of Devon and Cornwall. Therefore, in 1943, work was begun on a lighter, more numerous variant that was essentially a scaled-down merchant navy, demonstrating a reduction in weight to only 77 tons, and having a length of 67 foot 4 3/4 inches buffer to buffer, 2 feet and 3 inches shorter than the merchant navies, the eastern section of the Southern Railway having once again been considered the main working ground of this new design, and thus the engines were scaled to operate within the highly restricted loading gauge of the Tunbridge to Bow Peep Junction route via Tunbridge Wells Central, as well as the Withered Arm routes to Bude, Padstow and Ilfracombe, although due to Eastleigh Works being filled to capacity with the construction of a second batch of Merchant Navy locomotives, all but 6 of the new Light Pacifics were assembled at Brighton Works, while the tenders were put together at the Ashford Works in Kent. In the same month as the end of the war in Europe, the first lightweight Bulleid Pacific, number 21C101, emerged from the Brighton Works, undertaking trials throughout the remainder of the month before entering traffic in June, being christened the name Exeter on July 10th in the bay platform at Exeter Central Station, its nameplate including a shield which depicted the towers of Rougemont Castle superimposed onto the City of Exeter coat of arms, Rougemont being the medieval keep of the city, which traces its roots back to the time of William the Conqueror, and is located on the hill immediately above Exeter Central Station. It wasn't all smooth operation with the Bulleid Pacifics, however, the class being notorious for their wheel slip, due primarily to the innovative constant oil bath for the chain valve gear, these problems being due to deficiencies in welding, which saw the oil baths leak onto the track and cause adhesion issues when attempting to pull away, and, in some cases, causing sparks that would ignite the copious amounts of fiberglass clad into the boilers of the locomotives, a byproduct of this being that the engines had an incredibly high oil consumption in order to keep the leaking baths supplied, while other problems with the class included a significant coal consumption and an extreme difficulty by shed crews to maintain the engines due to the presence of the air-smooth casing. Entering service wearing the Southern Railway's malachite green with yellow lining, the first examples of the lightweight Pacifics were allocated to Withered Arm duties in Devon, working between Exeter and Ilfracombe, and down to Plymouth via Oakhampton, with 27 examples allocated to the sizable depot at Exmouth Junction by 1946, alongside 5 Merchant Navy engines, which would power the trunk services between London Waterloo and Exeter, the initial examples of lightweight units being christened the titles of towns and cities in Western England, and were therefore dubbed the West Country Pacifics, although with the introduction of this class onto the eastern section of the network in Kent, these class members adopted titles commemorating the Battle of Britain, the decisive aerial engagement between the RAF and the Luftwaffe, which helped to fend off a potential invasion by the armies of Nazi Germany, the subsequent Battle of Britain class, adopting the names of RAF squadrons and air bases. In January 1948, as the Big Four reeled in bankruptcy after the onslaught of World War II, the government of Prime Minister Clement Attlee formally nationalised the rail network to create British Railways, and in a manner of protest against this move, Oliver Bulleid left his position on what was now dubbed the Southern Region and instead took up the role of consulting mechanical engineer for the Irish State Railway, eventually being promoted to chief mechanical engineer before retiring in 1958, passing away in 1970 at the age of 87. The primary reason for Bulleid's departure from British Railways being due to the loss of a certain degree of autonomy he had previously enjoyed under the Southern Railway. As for his Pacifics, by the time nationalisation became effective, 70 light Pacifics and 20 merchant navies had been built, but with the Southern having ordered a new batch of the latter just prior to their absorption into British Railways, the final build-out came to 30 merchant navies when production ended in 1949, and 110 light Pacifics by 1951, these engines being delivered by both Brighton and Eastleigh Works, and adopting the new numbering arrangement of BR, with merchant navy locomotives taking on the number 35XXX, and light Pacifics 34XXX. Although as the assembly run ended for the light Pacifics in 1951, the continued issues of port adhesion meant the very last example, 34110, was retained by Brighton Works in order to trial a conventional valve gear, though this proposal was eventually abandoned, and the engine entered traffic in January 1952 with Bulleid's original gear, and was eventually christened 66 Squadron. The period immediately following nationalisation was indeed a busy one, as the newly formed British Railways began early developments on a new breed of steam locomotive that would be the power of the network for the 1950s, with the 1948 exchange trials, a series of tests where locomotives of the former Big Four were transferred to the main lines of their previous rivals to assess their performance, seeing West Country Pacifics put to work on the scenic Highland Line between Perth and Inverness, the ex-Midland Railway trunk line between London St Pancras and Manchester Central, and the ex-Great Central route between London Marylebone and Manchester London Road, while in May 1949, 34059 Sir Archibald Sinclair underwent trials between London Liverpool Street and Norwich, followed by further tests of light Pacifics on the Great Eastern through 1951 and into 1952, with 4 engines eventually seeing brief use on the main line out of Liverpool Street and were allocated to Stratford Depot in East London. Another brief attempt to improve the breed took place even before nationalisation, when in July 1947, 21C119 Bideford underwent a short-lived trial as an oil-burning locomotive, which involved installing an oil tank in the former coal bunker of the tender, this treatment originally to be applied to 30 of the light Pacifics, before being scrapped altogether due to the cost of foreign oil imports in the period following World War II, and thus Bideford was returned to its normal use as a coal-burning steam locomotive. Entering the 1950s, British Railways continued to tinker with the Bulleid design in order to improve the performance and efficiency of the engines, including a reduction in boiler pressure across both classes from 280 psi to 250 psi in order to make them cheaper to maintain, permitting a more common grade of steel to be used in the firebox, although the nub of the engine's main issues was the incredibly innovative chain-driven valve gear and oil bath, which required difficult and expensive work to keep operational and would often lead to poor availability among the locomotives as they spent more time than normal out of service, exacerbated further by a potentially deadly incident on April 24, 1953, when Merchant Navy 35020 Bibby Line fractured its crank axle while approaching Crewkerne Station at speed, causing the thrashing connecting rod to tear apart the platform and canopy roof as it passed through the station, the incident at Crewkerne also highlighting a propensity for metal fatigue within the engines that led to all merchant navies being withdrawn in order for a redesigned crank axle to be implemented. Therefore, in 1954, the Chief Technical Assistant of the Locomotive Department at the Brighton Works, Ronald G. Jarvis, was tasked with comprehensively modifying the locomotives to remedy this fault, Jarvis having taken over on Bulleid's Leader project after his departure from British Railways in 1949, the Leader being an ill-fated attempt to marry the performance of a steam locomotive with the practical design of fledgling diesels by having what was essentially a steam engine with 2 cabs, this scheme being discontinued in 1951 after it was found that encasing the boiler inside a superstructure meant having to dismantle the entire locomotive in order to undertake routine maintenance. For the Bulleid Pacifics, Jarvis proposed an extensive rebuild of every merchant navy and light Pacific currently in operation by adopting many features from the BR standard locomotive classes that had been introduced from the turn of the decade, removing the air-smooth casing for ease of maintenance, replacing the chain-driven valve gear with 3 separate sets of Walschaerts valve gear, and exchanging the fast-moving and unpredictable Bulleid steam reverser for a screw-link version, with 35018 British India Line being the first merchant navy to undergo this treatment in 1956, and 34005 Barnstable being the first West Country Pacific in 1957, the rebuilding scheme placing as much emphasis as possible on bringing the locomotives in line with the appearance of BR standard classes like the Britannia Pacific, adopting large smoke deflectors to help push exhaust gases away from the cab. While the rebuilding was indeed controversial, with Oliver Bulleid himself even stating that he'd rather have his locomotives scrapped than be rebuilt, the new mechanics of the engines worked wonders for their performance and efficiency, reducing maintenance costs by 60% and coal consumption by 8.4%, guaranteeing the class a minimum of 25 additional years in service, as, at the time, it was anticipated that mainline steam would continue to see operation until the 1990s at the very latest. Although as the first examples entered the works to be rebuilt, the justification for the whole scheme was stripped away following the drafting of the 1955 Modernisation Plan, which proposed the eradication of steam traction on the BR network by the end of the 1960s in favour of diesel and electric replacements. In February 1956, the Kent Coast Electrification scheme was approved by the BR Board and would be delivered in 2 phases, the first phase being on the Chatham Main Line to Margate and Ramsgate, and the second phase being to Dover via Ashford, the former South Eastern Railway main line to Dover being the domain of up to 30 light Pacifics and numerous merchant navies, which were allocated across 4 depots at Stewart's Lane, Bricklayers Arms, Ramsgate and Dover, electric services on the Phase 1 section commencing from June 15, 1959, although steam would remain in evidence on the route via Ashford until Phase 2 was energised on June 18, 1962, eradicating all steam traction on the southeastern division of British Railways. In the face of the impending end of steam, the rebuilding programme for the Bulleid Pacifics was wrapped up prematurely in May 1961, with all merchant navies and 60 light Pacifics being given this treatment, the last rebuilt unit being 34101 Heartland, although despite the many maintenance cost savings and reduced coal consumption, the rebuilding did also include some adverse outcomes, in that, with balance weights being added to the wheels, a hammer blow effect became evident on the track which required increased maintenance of the permanent way, while rebuilt light Pacifics were found to be 4 tons heavier than their unrebuilt counterparts, which barred them from use on the former withered arm routes west of Exeter. While this restriction was eventually lifted, and rebuilt units could operate along the trunk route between Exeter and Plymouth via Oakhampton, though they were still banned from working to the resort destinations of Barnstable, Ilfracombe and Padstow, by 1962, British Railways were undertaking major border changes of the trackage that had previously belonged to the Big Four, and from September of that year, former Southern Railway metals west of Salisbury came under the control of the Western region as compensation for the former Great Western Main Line between Wolverhampton and Birkenhead, falling into the hands of the Midland region. The 37 Exmouth Junction allocated Bulleid Light Pacifics therefore coming under Western Region management, who placed a greater preference on their own route to the West Country from London Paddington to Exeter via Newbury, Castle Carey and Taunton. The result was the former Southern Railway main line to Exeter being stripped down thoroughly to the point that it was even threatened with closure, this once double-track primary route being reduced to a single-track secondary railway with a sporadic service, while through steam-hauled services from Waterloo to Exeter and Plymouth ceased on September 4, 1964, as Bulleid Pacifics were replaced by a new breed of diesel hydraulics, including Class 35 Hymex and Class 42 warships, the very last use of southern steam in the Exeter area, ending in 1965. However, as a final hurrah for the Bulleid Pacifics in their twilight years, Light Pacific No. 34051, Winston Churchill, had the distinction of hauling the funeral train of its namesake, former Prime Minister and hero of World War II, Sir Winston Churchill, from London Waterloo to Hamborough via Reading and Oxford on January 30, 1965, the funeral train comprising 7 coaches, the last of which carried the coffin, while a unique disc head code representing V for victory was displayed to denote Churchill's famous gesture during the height of the conflict. In the end, the last domain of the Bulleid Pacifics was on the Waterloo to Bournemouth and Weymouth route, with as many of the surviving examples being transferred to this service as possible in order to maintain a core operation until electrification of the route to Bournemouth, which had been approved in September 1964, could be undertaken. Mass locomotives withdrawals having commenced from as early as April 1963 with unrebuilt engines, before the first rebuilt example, 34028 Eddystone, was taken out of service in 1964, having only worked at most 5 of its proposed 25-year life extension. While elsewhere, overhauls ceased, maintenance became minimal, and any spare parts required to keep remaining locomotives serviceable were salvaged from withdrawn units, the last of these engines to undergo an overhaul being 34089 602 Squadron, which was undertaken during October 1966, with less than a year to go before all steam traction out of London Waterloo ceased. The end finally came on July 9, 1967, as following the last steam-hauled diagrams between Waterloo, Salisbury, Southampton, Bournemouth and Weymouth, the Bulleid Pacifics bowed out of service after 25 years, with rebuilt West Country Pacific, 34021 Dartmoor, being the last of these engines to run under its own power in BR service as it worked light engine from Waterloo Station to Nine Elms Locomotive Depot, having hauled the Southampton boat train as its final revenue-earning work, Bulleid Pacifics being distributed to scrapyards across the UK, including Cashmore's in Newport, South Wales, and the Woodham Brothers at Barry Docks. Happily though, for those engines sent to Barry, due to the high workload of Woodham Brothers Limited, who found it easier and more lucrative to scrap railway wagons, steam locomotives were kept in store rather than being broken up, so as to provide dismantling work in the event of a downturn in wagon scrapping, allowing preservationists the opportunity to rescue 10 merchant navies and 26 light Pacifics, while 3 examples, 34023 Blackmore Vale, 34051 Winston Churchill, and 35028 Clan Line had been preserved directly from British Railways upon their withdrawal, the surviving examples of Bulleid's Pacifics proving to be superb locomotives in preservation due to their good route availability and ample power, some engines even having returned to the main line for the haulage of rail tours, most notably the unrebuilt 34067 Tangmere, the rebuilt 34046 Braunton, and rebuilt 35028 Clan Line. In the end, the Bulleid Pacifics illustrated an incredibly innovative series of locomotives, which were the mainstay of express passenger services out of London Waterloo and Victoria for nearly 30 years, and although many of their cutting-edge facets, such as the chain valve gear and oil bath lubrication, did dampen their performance and push up their maintenance costs, they were otherwise superb machines that proved their versatility on all manner of operations, continuing to show their worth even in preservation as the last glorious outing of the 1920s and 1930s Art Deco era to work on Britain's railways.